What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This week I have another bonus episode for y'all, and I have Matteo Marchionni back on the show to talk about this 9/11 documentary that's out on Netflix. It's pretty interesting. There's quite a bit to it, and it was better than I thought it would be. We'll start there, and then we'll talk about more. But everybody, just be sure to share the show. Of course, you find it at the Libertarian Institute, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, Facebook, MeWe, Twitter. Donation information is in the show notes page. And as always, the sponsor is Paloma Verde. If you're looking for high quality CBD products, find it at Paloma Verde store or PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Just be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, to get 25% off when you check out. All right, Matteo. Just overall impressions of the documentary here.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on again. So overall impressions, I would say that what I thought first of all was I was pleasantly surprised, I should say, because I wasn't expecting it maybe to be so somewhat critical of the whole war on terror over the past 20 years. Coming from such a big, maybe media conglomerate, right? But I think it does give a decent overview of the whole, panoramic starting from the Mujahideen and the war against the Soviets during the 1980s, leading up to 9/11, which is kind of big focus of the initial part. And then it goes into kind of a bit of the history, touches upon Iraq a little bit, but it's mainly the whole thing is on Afghanistan. Up until Biden, announcing the withdrawal from Afghanistan just a couple of months ago. So it does really give a nice, overview, especially for people who are just dipping the toes and want a starting point. Um,
That's a
yeah, other,
that's a good
yeah.
point because my take on it was it's a little bit of a limited hangout where they give you far more of the truth than you would expect like a propaganda documentary on Netflix to give you. But at the same time, they often stop short of making full criticisms. They give platforms to some of the worst war criminals. Petraeus, Alberto Gonzalez, H.R. McMaster, I believe McChrystal is in there, and just like several other people who are absolutely terrible. At the same time, Tom Drake does appear, Karen Greenberg, and a couple other people. Some of the Guantanamo Bay former employees who quit over it, and so there is quite a bit of truth in it, but there isn't. It isn't all there, and so well, I guess we'll get into the nuance here. But let's just start off with episode one, which I guess was the least substantial as far as information wise. It's a lot of footage and talking about, what happened on the day of 9/11. They have several different individual people giving their like anecdotal stories of what happened. I'm sure there's value in it. It's interesting. I think it's fairly well done. I'm sure it's like fairly accurate and fair. But at the same time, like I just didn't have a whole lot, to say or disagree with or anything about it other than like, they do like a fairly nice job of like portraying some of the events of the day. But they do start to weave in the narrative of like actually how 9/11 happened in there too. And at least one of the things that they definitely don't do is, and actually almost directly refute, is to say that the planes don't come out of the clear blue sky, and that there like is other stuff like the as you say, going back to the support for the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan, leading up and talking about some of the hijackers and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on episode one, Mateo?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall the series is very well done, like even cinematographically, if that's a word. But yeah, the first episode is very, yeah, as you said, it's really well put together, but it talks a lot about 9/11 and what happened that day, first responders, and all that sort of information with, obviously people who were there as a testimony. And it's not something particularly original, I would say. Like there's been so many documentaries done on that already. But I guess it has to be in there, right? If you have to tell a story of this kind. So, um, yeah, a lot more, as we were discussing before recording, a lot more emotional, I would say, the first part, which is, something that for people in the US, I guess, mostly towards who this is targeted, I guess. But yeah, then it changes as it goes forwards.
Yeah, and I guess that one is one like kind of important thing to note about that is when it goes forward, it does cover things like the killing of innocent people in Afghanistan or Iraq, or even the rape of boys in Afghanistan, or drone strikes, torture in Guantanamo Bay, but none of it is presented as cinematically or as emotionally with as much music as this opening 9/11 attack episode. Which in a way I guess is kind of understandable, but at the same time, like, something to be aware of. It's really trying to pull at your heartstrings during the attack, and less so when we're talking about the Afghan bodies being peed on by American soldiers or something like that.
Yeah, and that actually made me think, after having watched the first episode, I was like, nice, well done. But at the same time, I was starting to think, okay, I have an idea of maybe, this is setting up the stage for what the rest of the documentary is going to be like when it comes to like the narrative, because that was so powerful that then surely you have to make as, some more argument that the whole war was justified. But, we'll talk about the next episodes.
Yeah, yeah. I believe even in the first episode, one of the people who appears is Barbara Lee, and that one of the things that I really do appreciate about the documentary is talking about Barbara Lee, letting her make her argument against the war on 9/11. And while I feel like in the latter episodes they really go heavy like on the generals who are trying to justify this thing, they did give at least some platform during this series to Barbara Lee, who was the lone congressman who voted against it, and the one who's been vindicated on that vote. I think she was right. We shouldn't have done that war, especially not give the blank check, because they've absolutely used it all over the place. But anything else on the first episode, or should we start talking about the second, which again will be more substantial? There's by the way, this is the 5-part Turning Point, I think it is, Netflix
Oh, yeah, we didn't
series.
even mention the title.
It's
Yeah.
the 9/11 Netflix series. That's why
Yeah.
everybody knows it as. It's like in the top 10 on Netflix, so you can't miss it.
Yeah, no, I think we can move forward. I was only going to add that not only is Babli, they show her clip, but she's actually part of the documentary. Like they actively interview her,
Yep.
which I thought was really good.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead on episode 2.
Yeah, so episode two is, talks more about a bit of the aftermath of 9/11, more detail about the first respondents, and also about, the first consequences that we start seeing because of that. So it does talk about Guantanamo. It does talk about, the Patriot Act, and also quite interestingly, it talks about also the Stellar Wind program regarding surveillance, which is very interesting. Again, that's why I meant before when it kind of I think touches upon lots of important points which are necessarily to need to be in there for a full understanding of the situation. Yeah, so I think it starts with the first respondents as well, and the people who were dead, who died that day as first respondents, and a little bit about how the hijack happened, and again regarding surveillance, it does actually criticize that the kind of surveillance state, although those were still early days, but you could already see where things were heading. And I think that was good because again, it does criticize it, and it's not just saying, okay, this is what happened, it was good, without any criticism of the decisions that were made by the Bush administration.
Yeah. So, one thing about the documentary and why I call it a limited hangout was it would do things like in the first episode, it talks about like bin Laden's past and traveling, to Afghanistan, then ending up in Sudan and carrying out some terror strikes there, and then going to Afghanistan. And then, for me, I understand that, that really debunks the safe haven myth because if bin Laden is, able to carry out terror attacks from Sudan and, go other places at will of the U.S. and then carry out other terror attacks, then, there doesn't seem like there's that much unique about Afghanistan. And yet they really do, I think, let the safe haven myth stand. And especially in the second episode, they really push it that there was like, a reason that we had to go to Afghanistan. And that was one I thought the disappointing parts about
Right.
the second episode.
Yeah, you're right. It does, well, it does clearly say, this was a response to bin Laden, but quickly it became a war of the whole of Afghanistan against the Taliban, who were ruling at that point in time, because yeah, they tried the safe haven, and so yeah,
Yeah.
they kind of gloss on that really quickly, and how then fighting for another 20 years against the Taliban is justified. Well, not that long, I guess, because they weren't in power for that long after the U.S. invasion. But anyway, I guess yeah,
But one thing they do talk about in that context, and that I was surprised about, is they really put a lot of time on what happened with bin Laden at Tora Bora and how he escaped. And I mean, I don't want to say we're very critical, but they were at least like, presented the narrative that, hey, like for some reason, Osama bin Laden was kind of cornered and then he just kind of got away.
Yeah, and he's in Pakistan now, apparently. Yeah, yeah, that was an interesting point as well. It's yeah, it's crazy that how then they another 10 years was spent there for until he before he was killed, right? But yeah, I think that's more or less all the important points for episode number two.
One thing I did want to say is in the episode two, they
Yeah.
have a lot of Bush administration officials, including his, I think, chief of staff, Andrew Card, and then the deputy attorney general, I think, Alberto Gonzalez. And he's John Ashcroft's deputy. I think that's where he is. I'm not exactly sure what his role is, but somewhere in like the Justice Department. And so when I watch it and I see these guys saying these things, to me it seems like a hell of an indictment of them. But at the same time, I could see other people watching it and being like, "Oh well, that kind of made sense, and I get why they did that then." And I do feel like these guys kind of did get a platform to make their somewhat weak case, but I don't know if they really exposed themselves as much as they should have, and a countering voice to some of these guys would have been nice a little bit more in the first and second episode.
Yeah, yeah, I agree on that.
All right, Mateo, episode three.
So episode three, it's where you start to get more of the testimonies of U.S. soldiers who were there on, deployed to Afghanistan. And I think the overall kind of gist of it, of episode three, is that, you start to understand kind of the narrative that the war was ultimately a failure for the most part, in many regards. It does touch upon Iraq briefly. It's like, we went to Afghanistan, then, this whole mess happened with Iraq. But, Iraq is quite and I'm glad they didn't spend too much time on it, because at this point it's uh,
But they
so
did do a
obvious.
really tricky thing in there, and they really promoted one of the Warhawk narratives. I think with the whole idea that everything in Afghanistan was going really, really, really well, and then we went to Iraq, and then things in Afghanistan started going not so
Right.
well. And that's a pretty powerful war state narrative that they kind of just snuck in there. But at the same time, they are I I feel like the documentary is just solidly critical of the Iraq War. I don't even think they really try at all to justify that. So at least there is that.
Yeah. It's like, how could you, right? It's like at this point, it's been so criticized from every single one. It's like, no, you can't justify that war in any aspect. But yeah, you're right. They do talk about that and how now, after a couple of years, the US was fighting these two massive wars, as in, very from what do you call it? I guess the expenses that would be poured into those wars, both in personnel and money. And I think this is where it started to come interesting was I can't remember the name because I didn't put it down, of one, especially one of the soldiers who was there in Afghanistan, who was deployed when he was really young, I think like 18, 19, something like that. And he says, like, we didn't know what we were doing. Like, we didn't know what our objective was from the start, essentially. There's even a clip. I don't know if this is in episode 3, to be honest, but of the soldier who's saying, I came here to fight, against Al-Qaeda and for 9/11, and nobody even talks about that anymore. It's like, what am I doing here?
The statements from the soldiers are fair. They enlisted, I guess if you say soldiers and you can talk about the generals and stuff, they had a little bit different things to say. But the soldiers who they had talk were pretty universally critical of the war. I didn't hear many of them like have too many positive things to say. In fact, one of the I think this ends up in the last episode, but one of the really positive, not powerful things that one of the soldiers says was like, the war becomes just about trying to stay alive, and so you're in Afghanistan killing Afghans so you don't die, but there's no other purpose to the war, and so leave. Is the obvious solution there.
Yeah.
But the from the all three of these episodes, they have a lot of, I think, they give good time and statements to, again, the enlisted soldiers. But again, then they had like the generals on, the real so-called experts to put it in the real perspective. But the soldier stories
Yeah.
are great. I think this is in the third episode. One of the crazy things they talk about is at the start of the war, there's a journalist who goes to, I don't know if he exactly said where, I'm guessing it's like around Mozar-e-Sharif or something like that, where the Northern Alliance is still holding out against the Taliban in 2001. And he says it's basically like World War I style trench warfare, where you have two trenches and people shooting at her, one from the side from the other, and the U.S. comes in with B-52s and completely wipes out the Taliban sides and just dropping all kinds of bombs. And it's just worth thinking about that. That's what we did at the start of this war. Is just, it was so unproportional. I mean, and I don't know. I had never realized that before, and it was quite crazy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the main problems with the whole war in Afghanistan was that they went for one objective and then it became an excuse for Iraq. It became fighting the Taliban. It became securing the whole world from terrorism. It's like that's where it became more of a mess, in my opinion. But yeah, and as we were saying, the soldiers, I think, did a really good job, and they talk about so many failures of the wars from so many aspects. Like they talk about obviously the nation building and the little collaboration that they had with people there, and we can maybe dig into that more later on, because there's a lot to talk about, and to the point where the corruption and how even the US had decided basically to, it was one of the generals, I think, from the Afghan military at the time, to choose the uniforms for the military. And they chose these, horrible uniforms in the sense that they didn't, I think they were green and
Yeah, they're forest camo for
right,
Afghanistan, which doesn't have
right,
forest. I think it
exactly.
actually created some problems and made them stick out like a sore thumb, even, and not
Yeah,
even quite. It wasn't just like unproductive or not helpful. It was actively counterproductive to have that colored camo. So yeah,
Yeah.
that was one of the. I think that is in the third episode, right, where they do get into like some of the ridiculous funding things that happened, where they built things in it. Are they talked about these planes they brought to Afghanistan from uh, your home country, Italy, and they never were able to fly. They couldn't get any of them off the ground. Wasted $400 million on that. They built a big military industrial like YMCA complex facility for some reason out of nowhere, Afghanistan, and it never got used, and spent 30 something $1 million on this, which are good stories to tell, but like the total amount of the corruption is just unbelievable. And one of the things I guess they don't do at all in the documentary is ever talk about where that money went. Lockheed Martin isn't the military industrial complex, like they're not named as the profiteers off this wars and the beneficiaries. And I guess another thing was, I don't know if you noticed, like the Afghans they had in were mostly almost all anti-Taliban, with like Hekmatyar, but particularly Masood, was this guy they have on here who's very anti-Taliban, part of the Taliban resistance, and they make him out to be quite the hero, I feel like, in this doc.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point there. I hadn't actually thought about it that much about the the military-industrial complex not being mentioned, and how all these companies and multinationals have profited billions and billions off of these wars. And yeah, it's a really good point. They do talk about the corruption. And there's been other documentaries I've seen where that is very evident, not only in like military equipment, but when it comes to schools that were built, hospitals that were built. They were built and then they were left to rot because they couldn't, because of the corruption, because there wasn't any way of sustaining them in the long term. Uh, but yeah, it's like there was actually, now that I think about it, I think it must have been in this episode where there's this guy who was doing research on how the money was being spent, and he goes to these different kind of sites in Afghanistan and shows how, look, this is it might have been that military base, and you just see everything that's just been left there, and I don't know how much money was spent on that, and it's just gone to complete waste.
Yeah. I believe in this episode is where they introduce the Afghanistan Papers, and they have some interviews with Craig Whitlock, who put that out for the Washington Post, and they do highlight some of the key things that were stated in here. But I guess why they should have asked more questions, like, weren't you lying, why didn't the war end, and stuff like that, where but at least they did highlight the statements from like Doug Lute and stuff like that about just how they had no idea what they were doing and it never made any sense. But then when the actual generals like are interviewed for it, they don't press them on these issues at all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they were mostly left, I mean, a bit everybody just to speak, without much questioning, for sure.
There's a couple times, particularly with the Stellar Wind, I think they seem to push Gonzalez a little bit on, and actually I feel like just ask like the normal like if you like murder somebody, right, it's not like a biased thing to be like, why did you murder that person like that. So if you're going to like torture people, to be like, weren't you torturing people, like isn't that against the law? That's not like crazy questions pushback to ask. And it really only seemed like it was done minimally, especially around the torture stuff. They really did like the whole dance around with, some people might think it was torture, but enhanced interrogation. Um, and I think there was a little bit more Gitmo stuff in this third episode. I believe it was where they have videos of like the guys essentially being held in the dog kennels, and they detail just a little bit. They really should have gone into more detail about what was done torture wise in Guantanamo Bay. I feel like this is a section where they do it very analytically. When they talk about it, they're like, he was waterboarded 100 and something times, and like, I don't think that means anything to anybody. And in fact, the fact that he did it 100 times almost makes it seem worse than like if it happened five, right? Like, oh, well, if they have a hard time, then whatever. And they really focus on mostly talk about the stress positions. I think they'll at one point that the thing that for me was like I was like, oh my god, in an outrage, about to throw something at the TV. And when I think it's Gonzalez is talking about like, oh, we only allowed them to, slap them with an open hand and stuff like this, and I would just stand up and slap him in the face and be like, you got a problem with that? uh, and all this crazy stuff that, just the way that they would justify it and write off the torture stuff was unbelievable.
Yeah, I don't know if this, I was going to plug, there's another documentary which came out earlier this year about Guantanamo called The Mauritanian. Anybody who's interested in that, I would recommend it. Does talk about, it's a film, kind of film, yeah, documentary. It's a one take basically. And it talks about, it's a real life experience of this guy who was basically held in Guantanamo for I don't recall how many years, but a long time. And how he was held there without any real charges. He was there because of some weird connection his brother or cousin had with Bin Laden over a phone call. Something really remote, a really remote connection. And for that, I'm sure there's lots of other cases that were the same.
Yeah. Yeah, so many of the people there, like a lot of them, they just let go. Like after a certain amount of time, the Bush administration let hundreds of them go because they just were nobodies. They weren't
Yeah.
terrorists at all. They were just Afghans. Some of them. So yeah, I guess that I don't know. Anything else on the third episode?
No, I'd say those are yeah, we've covered everything there.
All right, so the fourth episode, one of the themes of it that I think bothered me the most was there was kind of a conflation of, and never really an explanation of like the difference between a terrorist group like Al Qaeda and a group that engages in terrorism, like, suicide ads targeted at civilians or something like that, like the Taliban, uh, because, it just kind of, it really buys into the safe haven myth and the fact that like the Taliban are like pro carrying out attacks on the United States, which really isn't the case. They're far more interested just in Afghanistan and weren't really supportive of what bin Laden with all this kind of stuff, right? And there's just it just the Taliban are like a terrorist group, and that gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and it is backed up by the fact that they did things like blew up, suicide bombers in markets in Afghanistan or something like that, but that doesn't mean that the Taliban are going to put people in planes to fly to the United States to blow up our buildings either.
Yeah, and that I think goes to show a bit of all the war and terror since 2001. Obviously, we had 9/11, which was huge. But then after that, and many people talking about how that was a failure in many ways from the U.S. intelligence. But it's like, that when has terrorism ever since been a real threat to the United States? It's like that's never really happened. You've had ISIS over the years, obviously carry out a few attacks here and there, but that's, those are lone wolf attacks. There's nothing of the nature of, as sophisticatedly organized as a 9/11. And that's usually the narrative that is justified for the wars and for the surveillance and all the developments that have happened there, even the foreign interventions in later on in other countries there.
Yeah. Well, all right. So this is something bad to the first episode that drove me nuts. Is they kind of said a couple of times, "Oh, there were a couple of things that maybe we could have looked into, and if we happened to maybe get lucky, we could have stopped 9/11." And that was just kind of the way that was left. Like, yeah, we made some mistakes. Things could have been a little different, and I wish they would have spent a little bit more time, maybe had like Colleen Raleigh or somebody in the documentary to really talk about like all the different efforts and ways that 9/11 could have been prevented, including like the FAA's effort to install more secure locks on the cockpit doors to essentially prevent planes from being taken over and being used as bombs. And I don't know, that was a roll bad. So what else on episode 4?
Yeah. So in episode 4, again, I think it talks also, again, there's an interesting episode about, I thought I know of it anyway, of the mo mosque that was gonna, was proposed to be built on Ground Zero. I'd never heard about that before. So that's one thing I'd learn. Maybe I guess not being
Oh,
American.
so this was crazy. So
Yeah.
this happened when I was a kid, right? Like I wasn't like watching the news or anything. Like, you know what I mean? I was just like it was at like at a time where I was like a teenager playing football. Like my priorities in no way were foreign policy, right? And there's this Ground Zero mosque that like you would just hear about, people talk about. And so you literally thought like people talked about it as there was going to be a mosque built where the Twin Towers once stood. What it was they were trying to build a community center that was going to be like a Muslim funded like community center, but it was going to be like open to anybody. They're going to like have a performing arts thing and allow like, whatever local school or, whatever people to like use it. Like it wasn't maybe they weren't going to like have the Book of Mormons played there or something like that, but I'm sure like, like a high school play, fine and stuff like that. It was portrayed as like going to be like a mosque on Ground Zero, like the Muslims were now coming to, erect a mosque on the site of their greatest achievement. And in fact, there were people in the United States who, in response to this made up story, were like calling for like the destruction of the Alaska Mosque and then like building like a temple on, to like pay Muslims back for a fake story in the United States. And this is one thing that you could like point the finger pretty much at the Republicans for.
Interesting, interesting. Because that's, well, the fact that they were going to build a mosque there in plain sight, where the Twin Towers are for, is kind of the, message that you get from the documentary. As someone who I wasn't that aware of this case, that's definitely how it came through. So I guess that's, a point of criticism, of the
Yeah, definitely.
documentary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you know what, that's a good point, because in the documentary they do like have all that b-roll footage of Fox News, and I guess if you just don't have the primer in your head of Republicans bad, like I'm guessing that makers probably just assume that if they b-roll like Kennedy and O'Reilly and everything like that, the audience is just gonna boo and jeer and assume everything they're saying is fake. But I mean, and they could have shown a map, which is really helpful to explain how the hell far away it was going to be. It was like 2 New York City blocks, so there were going to be like 40 stores or
Right.
40 whatever the hell's in between there and the actual Ground Zero site. Yeah. So what else on episode 4?
Yeah, I think they make. I mean, that was one of the things that stood out for me. And they talk about again Guantanamo. And let me see, I've got a couple of notes. Yeah, because obviously they talk about how Saddam basically had weapons of mass destruction, and to back that up, they were. There was this guy, Al-Libi, who basically was tortured to say that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and then later on he says, "Well, they tortured me. What was I supposed to say?" And a whole war was launched on that. But yeah, I don't know if you had any other points on episode 4. I think yeah, more
No,
about
I don't think so.
transition thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead and go ahead with episode 5.
So episode 5 starts with
And
finally
this
10
is
years
the final
later.
one for people who haven't watched it. Just
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, so they're all about an hour long, so 5 episodes, yeah. So the last one starts with, after 10 years, finally, we've captured bin Laden, right? So, mission accomplished. But obviously, so much is going on at that point, outside of, like, bin Laden's not even talked about it at that point. And they talk about, the responsibles, the trial, sorry, for 9/11, who were responsible. And I think, and this is when we have a transition point, obviously, because we have a new administration, because the Obama administration comes in. And they talk a lot about drones, which I thought was also an interesting point, and a very important one for that matter, because obviously this kind of we're getting far away from what we've been discussing up until now, actual 9/11, but we're more into the war on terror, as we know it today at this point. So we're talking about drone strikes and the radicalization that comes also from that. We've seen it recently from the actual withdrawal, when, yeah, after the withdrawal, the US started striking in sites in Afghanistan to take out, ISIS-K. And it turns out they kill like 10 civilians. And, what are people who live in Afghanistan going to think about that? These are people who are bombing us, and killing us. And so that obviously radicalizes people. And I think that was a good point. They talk about that with regards to Obama. And then obviously even increased even further when Trump came in. Um, uh, and then we go into the transition, I guess, to another presidency. So I guess in episode 5, they transition really quickly through the
Wait,
Obama
can I do
administration.
one thing on the Osama bin Laden raid? They had
Yes,
Petraeus.
yes.
They recorded Petraeus saying that like the Osama bin Laden raid wasn't like the most dangerous or most important thing going on that night. There was like 12 other raids going on in Afghanistan, and like he says it as like oh yeah, so there was no question that the war was gonna end, like kind of just as a matter of factly kind of thing. But this was another time where I was like standing up ready to scream at the TV, like, are you serious? Like, you didn't
Yeah.
even think Osama bin Laden, the raid on the night you took him out was the most important thing going on? And like, it just goes to show how like much they even lost sight of 9/11. It really instantly, but the whole time.
Yeah, really good point, actually. That is a good case in point of how, yeah, the narrative had changed, or the objectives, whatever, had changed at that point. Yeah, they take out 9/11. It was like, yeah, we cheered that night, if even, but we had so much to do, for, around the world, and well, especially the Middle East, and that, that wasn't even important. It's not only the whole reason which we actually went into the country in the first place, but that puts things into perspective, I guess. But yeah, then we get, I don't know if you have anything more on that, but obviously to the more recent kind of Trump administration for with the Taliban deal and going forwards from there.
Yeah, yeah, I love the transition from Obama to Trump. It switches from like a very like kind of matter of fact coverage again to the bad guy has arrived. Bum bum bum. And go ahead, tell us about this Trump coverage.
Yeah, of course they talk about the deal, and how, well, I guess they do mention that Trump did talk about, at least in his campaign, about withdrawing from these, the forever wars. And so he signs this deal with the Taliban, to do that. And then, here I think is where it gets a bit like the more recent stuff. It gets a bit more. You've got lots of testimonials, at least a few from the NAA, people who were enrolled in the NAA, so the Afghan National Army, saying how we're always gonna we're gonna fight if the Taliban put up a fight when the US leaves, and it just goes to show that it was just a lie, really, because the way the military, 300,000 people enrolled in the Afghan military when the US withdrew, just fell in a matter of 11 days. 20 years of training, really, and all that money, and there's obviously lots of reasons for that. But yeah, it was interesting to see these perspectives of these people in the army who maybe even really believed in that was going to be the case. That the US had built an army that was going to be able, to withstand that. But I think anybody who had a knowledge on the situation knew that wasn't the case, and that was evident from just a few years after 9/11. You have generals talking about it's kind of nation building. It's just a mess over here.
So, the fifth episode for me was by far the worst. Like the rest of them I would like probably give C's to, maybe a B on particularly the third one. I felt like did a pretty good job on the war in Afghanistan, some like Guantanamo, like there was quite a bit hard. But the last one I felt like was a lot of just the war state narrative, especially when it came to Afghanistan and what the US had built there. In one sense, in like the second or third and fourth episode, they're talking about how the Afghan government is a kleptocracy. It has brain cancer. It can't survive. And then they're like, Trump gave up on a perfectly good democracy in Central Asia that respected women's rights and sent little girls to school. And just, like one episode ago, you were like, yeah, everybody knew that the warlords had a bunch of little boy set slaves. And so, and that doesn't come up at all. And so that part to me was like absolutely astounding, especially when they called Afghanistan democracy. I mean, a kleptocracy is far more accurate of a name for that government. It is no way a democracy. You can't call it a democracy when every election the second place guy protests until he gets his spot in the government. That's absurd. Only 20% of the people voted in the last election. Like 1,000 of the polling sites weren't open. That's not democracy. It's a joke. And yet that really got me worked up, that one.
Yeah, yeah. The fifth episode, more recent stuff, obviously stuff that's been maybe less talked about, even debated. And yeah, from that point of view, it was yeah, pretty. Yeah, I would agree. It's probably the worst one of them all. It also probably was a bit rushed because, as I say, they talk about Biden as well, and so that's only happened a couple of months. Like, how did you put that into the documentary?
Yeah, they actually had like the fall of Kabul. Like I don't know if
Yeah,
they have footage, but they at least had like a little like shot screen of like, the fall of Kabul happened on April or August 15th, blah 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 blah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. They mention, I think this is really towards the end, how, they do talk about how the US has done good in the country in the sense that, there has been progress in education for most people in other realms of society. you know, uh, Now that the Taliban have taken over, I don't know. I mean, first of all, I don't know to what extent, that was true. Definitely things did improve from that aspect, I would say, from, when the Taliban were there. But it just wasn't, a sustainable thing. And they obviously talk about the criticism that Biden took from government officials, from everybody, by political pundits everywhere, left, right, and center. But who is to say that another 10, 15 years, whatever, would have resulted in something different? In fact, a rational, I think, decision or a rational way of thinking would suggest that, in fact, withdrawal is the right decision, just because the data you have up until now is that 20 years or 15, whatever, of nation building is resulting in this. Then how can that doesn't justify continuing that. And That's what's happened now. So I think it was the right decision anyway. But they don't touch upon that extensively in the documentary.
Yeah. So yeah, I thought that was kind of ridiculous at the end when they're talking about how they built up the Afghan government. So first, they have in the documentary, they cite, Craig Whitlock in the Afghan Papers talking about how they like mess with all the statistics to make it so that the war effort always looked like it's going well. And then they have like the generals on there going 40% of the people in Afghanistan that go to school are girls or something like that, which is a kind of, it sounds like, maybe 40% of like girls go to school or something like that. I think, less than half of Afghan girls are still illiterate. All like, I don't love these agencies because I think they do have bias. Although if they do have bias, it's a pro-American bias, so they would have been like building up the reputation of the Afghan government, not tearing it down. But like Freedom House and all these agencies have been rating like Afghanistan not free and having significant lacking of women's rights in Afghanistan, this whole time. And I think it was maybe like far less directed and cruel towards women as like the Taliban in general wore during the 90s at the very least. But at the same time, there's definitely like a counter to that in the indiscriminate way the U.S. killed and terrorized the Afghan people. And there is a really, I don't know if you read it yet, The Other Woman by Anand Gopal. It's in the New York Times. I'll send it to you if you haven't. And basically, he kind of talks about how like these gains were made made in the city for like the 30% of women who live there, but was at expense of the women in the countryside where we've been fighting the Taliban all along, who have been subject to the things that we do demonstrate, or they do show in the documentary, like the indiscriminate bombings that killed civilians, or things that Anand Gopal talks about in his article, like soldiers just coming into homes and kicking out people, or killing people, or one of the things in the documentary was absolutely crazy. They said in Helmand, the Taliban got so good at planting bombs that they were having to like detonate grenades every 100 feet to just move forward. So there'd be these
Yeah,
massive explosions everywhere. I
that
mean, that
was
had to be
ridiculous.
absolutely
Yeah.
terrifying for all these, everybody, but the women too.
Yeah, and well, it also shows how failed of it, the U.S. intervention was there. It's like it was like they talk about how the Taliban, obviously, you're bombing your way through the country, like literally. Um, the Taliban could see these people, the U.S. military coming from miles away. It was like I mean, the US was never built to fight a war of this sort. Even like if it's the US military is very more traditional, I would say, way of fighting warfare. And obviously, it's adapted over the years and it's still transitioning. But starting from the war in Vietnam and up until all these wars in the Middle East, and that's being proven. And I think another very important point about the failure, and I saw a documentary. Well, not a documentary; it was a lecture about this. It's how when we talk about Afghanistan as a whole, or what the U.S. was doing there, but even now, when the Taliban have taken the country, the way we think about Afghanistan as a country, as a nation, it's a very modern kind of Western way of thinking about it, because Afghanistan is divided in so many different cultures and sects and tribes, and none of them necessarily think about themselves as one nation. And actually, they live in lots of different places, maybe in rural places, and they don't consider the boundaries of what we consider Afghanistan as Afghanistan. It's like, yeah, whatever. That's why maybe when the Taliban came in, there was no real opposition. It's like for us, there's no bigger geopolitical goal here. It's more like we just want to live our day-to-day life in peace.
Yeah. I think especially like the Trump part of the documentary where they go through his peace deal, the Obama piece or the Biden piece, and then the end is all war state narrative for the most part. This was like again the last 20 minutes was I feel like the most frustrating part of the whole thing, where like they have like they're basically bashing the deal that Trump made with the Taliban, even and suggesting that like the Taliban are I mean, the Taliban do evil things. Don't get me wrong, but like the Taliban are like this particularly like evil actor in Afghanistan. All this, it was totally one sided. They only have, mostly U.S. security state officials speak towards this part, and then there's this one guy who says the most unreality thing maybe in the whole documentary, where he's like, and Biden just left Afghanistan without negotiating with the Taliban. There was already a deal with the Taliban, you moron. That's why we were leaving. And he's like, we just left. There was a deal to leave that the Taliban followed, and that's why we were leaving. And this guy's like, that didn't happen, and I don't know how that made it in there. And then the last like 10 minutes was like a call, like a kind of a callback to the first episode of like 9/11 victim survivors chatting about 9/11.
Yeah, and well, and it was even pushed forward, right? The withdrawal date from the initial deal, because it was May 1st, and then it
Yeah,
became August 31st. So yeah.
yeah. Well, Matteo, I mean, if you have anything else on episode 5, go ahead with that. But like, any overall thoughts or anything else on this documentary?
Not really. I would just say if you're, as I said, I guess hinted at the beginning, if you're interested, want to learn, a little bit about the whole war on terror, the conflict, how it's a little bit of background up until now. It's a really good piece to like dip your toes in, but don't take everything at face value. I think it's got lots of important milestones, and then from there you can take those individually. and kind of research those if you're interested further. Um, but yeah, I would say overall I'd recommend it. It's not as I thought I might have to not recommend it when before I started watching it. But given what I've seen previously in other things by Netflix. But yeah, no, I would say go ahead, but always apply your own critical thought on it.
Yeah, that's got to be the thing. As long as somebody will, could like kind of think about it, I think it's actually not bad because you do have all these statements from government officials that, from my perspective, because of everything else I know, I feel like are really damning. But I could see somebody kind of eating it up as propaganda too. So I'm like skeptical on who I would recommend it to, but I definitely would recommend it to some people. And certainly, if you recommend it to somebody who you're not sure about, send them a copy of Fool's Errand or at least the series that Scott Horton did. I think it's the 14-part series of Enough Already he did. That's on YouTube. That is probably like a total of an hour and a half or so. And I think if you watch this documentary and then like watch Scott's piece, it would fill in enough of the missing pieces to really turn you against the wars. And so, it can be at least a good starting point. Matteo, thanks so much for coming on and doing this with me. I'm really glad that you brought it up because I don't know if I would have watched this otherwise. I sometimes skip out on the Netflix documentaries. But this one I definitely do think was like I'm glad I watched it because of kind of what I learned about some of these people and what they said, and also just to get like the timeline back because so much of this happened when I was like a kid in school and just war wasn't my top priority. You are the host of the Neutral Partisan Report, and I noticed you just put out an episode pretty recently again, right?
Yeah, so I've been, have been having a bit less time to do news as I used to. But yeah, as the whole withdrawal has been unfolding in Afghanistan. I've covered the Biden speeches there, especially when he was talking about the withdrawal. And those will go quite in depth, kind of looking at, what he was saying as he was saying it throughout time, which I think is the best way to kind of try and understand the perspective there. And yeah, other than that, I'm trying to transition to more documentary style things rather than day-to-day news coverage. And so hopefully that's what the future holds for my content.
All right, and where can people follow you?
The main place I would say is Twitter at NP Report. That's where I, retweet what's going on, give a few opinions, interact with people, and give my thoughts, really.
All right, Mateo, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
All right, Cal. Thank you.